Hello and welcome at our 11th Angular.love Meetup. I am Mateusz and I have a pleasure of being your host for today's event. I represent Angular.love community, which has organized this gathering. We are live streaming straight from our office in Warsaw. Please let us know in the comments from which city you are joining us. Before we kick things off, I would like to share some important information. First and foremost, today we have three exciting talks lined up featuring Alisa Duncan, Stefan Haas, and Marko Stanimirovic. Following each talk, we'll have a Q&A session, so don't hesitate to drop your question in the chat. Secondly, we have also organized the contest on our social media, and the winner will be announced by the end of the stream, so make sure that you will stay with us till the end. At our meetups, your voice matters most. Help us make future events even better by sharing your thoughts in our post-event survey. Your feedback is priceless. Thank you for being a part of our community. Link to the survey will be present at the chat. We also want to express our gratitude to our event partner and sponsor, House of Angular. The House of Angular team specializes in consulting and Angular code audits. If you need assistance with your project or want to start the new development the right way, don't hesitate to reach out to them. We want also express and extend our thanks to our community partners, Angular Belgrade, Angular Athens, Angular Birmingham, and Google Developer Groups. Google Developer Groups is organizing a conference on the 25th of November, so make sure you will be there with them. All of these communities play a pivotal role in advancing the global community of Angular developers. With that, let's dive into our first talk. Let me introduce Alisa Duncan. She is not only a Google developer expert in Angular, but also a woman tech maker ambassador, a core team member of NG Girls, and dedicated voluntary at community events that support underrepresented groups in the tech. Today, she is here to share her expertise on the topic, There is Safety in Angular. Without further ado, welcome Alisa. Hello, Alisa.
Hello, good morning, or hello, good afternoon for y'all.
Hello. We are excited to have you here today. And before we dive, could you share your experience presenting at NGConf this year? Because I know that you were there and you have your prediction.
Yes, so speaking at NGConf is really exciting. There's a lot of people there. There's a lot of excitement about Angular, and it's a great NG community to be part of. It's also really nerve-wracking to speak in front of that many people, but I always know that the community is always rooting for you, right? Because they want to hear the latest and greatest, and so it's a really fun conference to speak at, and it's really great to see all the people who are so enthusiastic about Angular there.
Okay, thank you. And we already know that the next NGConf will be at the March, probably next year.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So without taking more time, the stage is yours. I wish you good luck and see you at the Q&A session.
Thank you. Is my screen? Okay, all right. So hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and have a chance to talk to you about safety in Angular, which is perfect because this month, October, is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So what a way to get started. Make sure that I have focus. All right. So it's also, though, Halloween, right? So that means that it's time for scary tale. So let me start this talk off with a really frightening tale. Let's say that you're a fan of K-dramas and you work on a K-drama fan site. On this fan site, you can navigate to an individual K-drama to add comments. So one day you do that, since you are the owner of the site, to add comments about your favorite K-drama. And when you're there, you see that there's already awful comments written in your name. And you know you're not the one who would add such awful things about your favorite K-drama, right? Oh no, what do? How do we stop this from happening to other K-drama fans? Well, we need to make sure we add security to our site. Because web vulnerabilities can cause risk to our assets. And those assets include our application, our data, end users and their data, as well as our reputation, not to mention it affects the bottom line. What this means is that it all adds up to liability. And that's a big, scary word for business decision makers and for financial folks within your company. They don't want liability. So we, as web developers, have a responsibility to make sure we're integrating security best practices into our everyday tasks and making sure we're doing that throughout the process, because this isn't something we can just throw over the fence to the security team at the very end. So who am I to be talking to you about this? I'm Alisa Duncan. I'm a senior developer advocate at Okta, an Angular GDE, core team of Veggie Girls, and you might have guessed that I'm a fan of K-dramas. You can find me on assorted social channels at Alisa Duncan. But I'm also just a regular dev, which means I'm not a security expert. However, through my job, I was afforded the opportunity to dig around in Angular's code base to look at security measures, and I found such great stuff in there that I wanted to share it with you today. You can't talk about web security without talking about the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP. This group's sole mission is to make the web a safer place. And it has a lot of different resources, documentation, and content to help us do so. One of the projects of OWASP is the OWASP Top 10. This is a prioritized list of web vulnerabilities, and it is identified by the number of incidences that it comes across of each of these vulnerabilities, as well as the impact of those vulnerabilities. And periodically, this list is updated, the most recently being in 2021. So today, we're going to talk about two of the items on this top 10 list: the number 1 item, broken access control, and the number 3 item, injection. Starting first with injection, which includes cross-site scripting, the bane of web developers, right? Cross-site scripting occurs when there's not good data and code boundaries and values. And then we take this polluted value and incorporate within our application, which allows attackers an avenue to perform unauthorized actions. So an example of a cross-site scripting attack is that K-drama fan site, where we can navigate an individual K-drama to add those comments. The hope is that comments are written in plain text and are very, very sweet and probably contains a lot of heart emojis. But that's not how it always is, right? There's always some jerk out there. And somebody adds a comment like this, where they're trying to take advantage of a vulnerability within your application. So this comment is added to the K-drama fan site and then saved to the database. Next time an unsuspecting K-drama fan arrives at the site, they see that link for free prices. And who isn't tempted to click on a link for free prices? We all love free prices. So they click on that link and they see this JavaScript alert that says, yikes. Fortunately, a JavaScript alert is startling, but otherwise not dangerous. Nothing really happened. However, the precedent that it sets is incredibly dangerous, because once an attacker is able to successfully run their script within your application, they can impersonate you, they can perform unauthorized actions, they can read and capture sensitive data, including your login credentials, and even run malware against your machine. I happen to think that K-drama fan sites are incredibly critical, right? But you may also be thinking about the apps that you work on. So consider what happens if vulnerabilities exist in financial applications or HR applications with all that employee data, or healthcare with all that medical information about people. Furthermore, consider what happens if the attacked user has elevated access within the application. Now they're able to see even more sensitive data or perform even more impactful actions. Oh no. So we need to watch out for cross-site scripting anytime there's poor data hygiene and that pollution of data and code. And anytime we're adding that untrusted data into our application via injection sinks. Fortunately for us, Angular is highly suspicious of the values that we add into the application and treats it all as untrusted and handles the data hygiene for us, which means that without any effort on our part, we have security when we use Angular. And I want to tell you about how that works. Anytime that we incorporate values within Angular using interpolation, Angular automatically escapes it. So we take a look at an example comment and use interpolation to add that to the app. Even if the comment is a purposely broken image that runs an alert upon failure, what we're going to see in the application with this comment added is the text for that comment exactly as is. It's been escaped. And it means that there's nothing for the browser to interpret run here because it's treated as just plain text. And we can verify that by inspecting the element and seeing that paragraph tag with that comment there as plain text. Whenever we incorporate values within Angular applications using property binding, Angular automatically sanitizes it. So if we look at an example, I'm so sorry. So I didn't explain what injection sinks are. So sinks are web API functions that allow us to create dynamic content that we expect today in the web applications that we create and use. And that information includes methods that append to the DOM, such as enter HTML, approaches to load external resources. That's an image's source, anchor tags href, or even a styles URL, and event handlers. So now let's take a look at an example. If we property bind an inner HTML to the comment, and that comment is that purposely broken image, what we're going to see is a broken image. If we inspect that element, though, we see the image element with the source, but no error function. And we'll also see that Angular gives us a warning in the console saying that it has sanitized some HTML and removed some content. So let's take a look under the covers of what Angular does for its sanitization process. After Angular has lists and lists of safe elements and attributes, and after Angular builds out the view that we'll be looking at, the tree for the view, it then traverses through the tree, looks at every element attribute to verify that it is safe for us to see. If we take a look at the code that does this element traversal, we see that there's a lot going on. So we're going to step through this in detail to make sure we truly understand every line of it. Or not. Let me summarize it for you. It's a lot of tedious work that we don't have to do. But I want to draw your attention to these lines of code. This is the list of valid elements, the list of valid attributes, and a list of attributes that explicitly require sanitization. So if we walk through this example with the broken image, what happens is the image tag is first evaluated, and it's identified as a safe void element, and so it is allowed to be continued to be evaluated by the element traversal code. Next, it goes to source. Source is a URL and explicitly requires sanitization. In our case, though, there's really nothing to sanitize. It's safe, right? It's just a value of 1. So it's allowed to be retained, which makes this image element a valid HTML element, and that's why we see that broken image in our application. Next, it moves to the on-error attribute. The on-error attribute is not a safe attribute, and that's why it's removed. If we change our example to another one that we looked at earlier with that free prizes here link, if we view this in the application with property binding, we see that link for free prizes. If we inspect that element, though, we see the paragraph tag with the anchor tag with an href of unsafe : JavaScript alert, and a warning that Angular has sanitized an unsafe URL. URLs require sanitization, and there is a regex pattern that it follows to ensure that it is safe. So it goes into the sanitize method, does that regex match, identifies that the URL is not safe, which is true, it is indeed unsafe. And that's why we see that console warning appear, as well as where Angular prepends the unsafe : to the URL, which makes it so that the browser is no longer able to interpret and run that link. And when you try clicking on it, nothing happens, which means that we're safe. Angular also allows you to add safe markup. Let's say that you want to allow rich text editors within your application, for example, or you want to allow your K-drama fans to add a comment like this. That says it's a wonderful drama, the best in strong font. They're able to do so, and we could see that the output is it's a wonderful drama, the best in strong font, because strong is a valid inline element. Angular also protects us against something called mutation cross-site scripting, and I want to call this out intentionally because cross-site scripting is really sneaky. There's all sorts of different flavors of how attackers can do so, and I feel like mutation crisis scripting is a particularly sneaky one. This is where HTML that was previously inert, that is safe, becomes unsafe through the process of the browser rendering the markup. This might happen because the attacker intentionally puts in a typo, And browsers are really helpful and will autocorrect it for us, but it makes it unsafe. How Angular helps us out is by repeatedly checking each one of those elements and attributes and traversing through that tree during the entire markup rendering process to verify that the final output is safe. How thorough is that? So as you can see, without any effort on our part, when we use Angular constructs of interpolation and property binding, we have safety. And Angular does the hard work of that data hygiene for us, of escaping the sanitizing, so we don't have to. So always use Angular constructs anytime you can, because when you do, you have the most amount of safety. Now, there might be a reason where you want to bypass Angular security mechanisms. I will warn you, when you do this, you're entering into some really dangerous territory, though, because you aren't getting yourself the protection mechanism that is afforded to you built in by Angular. But there might be legitimate reasons why you do this, like when you legitimately need video trailers in your K-drama application. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to bind a link to an iframe, so we have this video player. Now notice that in my example, I'm calling out that it is a trusted video link. You want to do this and make sure that that value you're passing in is trusted, because you're not going to get that built-in sanitization. So you could potentially be opening yourself up to vulnerabilities here. So you want to make sure that you are trusting this link as much as possible by limiting the attack vector. If we take that iframe and put it in a component, what we'll do is inject the DOM sanitizer. The DOM sanitizer has methods to bypass security trust for the type of value that we're trusting, in this case, a resource URL. And we're passing in a safe link. That safe link right now I have hard-coded in the application. So I mean, clearly we wouldn't really need to do this. But imagine that some of that value comes from some external source. What you want to do is limit the attack vector by making sure that you are only allowing the smallest little bit that you need available for input. So we are defining the video hosting site, for example, and forming that URL and only allowing the video ID, for example. But once we have the safe link as possible, we'll pass it into that bypass security trust method for the type of value we're trusting, and it returns a safe type of value that we're trusting. This signifies to Angular to skip sanitization so that we can see the video player. Now, the reason why we have to do this legitimately is because resource URLs have bits of code in them so we can view the videos. So we have to bypass sanitization in order to have this video player. I mentioned the type of value that we're trusting a couple of times. And what that really is are security contexts, of which Angular defines 5. You don't include none, that is. Angular defines HTML, style script URL, and resource URL. And the reason why it does this is because sanitization is contextual, meaning that the way you sanitize for these different elements are different. So we have to be explicit and tell Angular what type of value it is. If we take a look at the implementation for the DOM sanitizer, we see that there's a bypass security trust method for each one of those security contexts, as well as an explicit sanitize method that we can call where we're passing in the security context. Once again, sanitization is contextual, so we have to be explicit. This method, deep down under the covers, will call in Angular's internal sanitization methods as well. You might be wondering, though, as I'm talking about security context and sanitization being contextual, why didn't we define what type of value that we were working with when we were doing the property binding earlier with the inner HTML? We didn't have to say it was an HTML, for example. That's because Angular tracks which security context to use based off of the attribute you're binding to. So if we take a look within Angular's code, what we see are maps where there's a security context type defined for the type of attribute, in this case, inner HTML. So we didn't have to pass anything in. Angular just knows how to sanitize it for us. So just because I talked about bypassing security, I want to call out once again with a great warning that with great power comes great responsibility. Because you can bypass Angular security doesn't mean you should. You shouldn't. You should always use Angular constructs and rely on that built-in security mechanism. If you do have to do this, though, legitimately have to do this, make sure you get a security audit so that you are limiting the attack vectors and trying to keep yourself as secure as possible. Now let's talk about the #1 OWASP vulnerability, broken access control. And this includes cross-site request forgery. Cross-site request forgery occurs whenever the application shares session cookies to untrusted sources. And an example example CSRF attack looks like this. Let's say that you're doing some online banking and your bank uses cookies to manage sessions. Next, you check your email and you got this kind of fishy email and you click the link. Hey, you know what? It happens to the best of us. Those attackers are really, really inventive in the way that they set those malicious emails, right? So you click the link. Unfortunately, though, the sender of this email is a attacker who is targeting your bank because your bank has some dubious security practices. So you clicked on the link and you were sent to a malicious site that made a forum post back to your bank, Yikes Bank, asking for a money transfer. Because you had that active session cookie and the session cookie wasn't guarded, you sent it along to the malicious site that turned around and forwarded it to your bank. Your bank gets this request, sees the active session cookie, and processes the transfer, which means that the attacker is able to walk away with your hard-earned cash. So there are some mitigation strategies that we can employ. One of them might be to not bank at Yikes Bank. But on top of that, we can also protect our cookies by using built-in browser capabilities. And this is something that Yikes Bank should be doing. On top of that, though, like the same site the same site property on cookies will be really protective here, and that's probably good enough. However, not all browsers support that, so you might need to have extra protection. And that mitigation strategy involves your backend providing you a CSRF token cookie, a special cookie that has a value inside. The front end will pass that CSRF token cookie back to the backend whenever it makes a call. Plus, it'll take the value of that cookie and then pass it in a secondary source. The backend then does verification to ensure the authenticity of this request by checking the CSRF token cookie value with that secondary value. This mitigation strategy is called the double submit cookie pattern. How Angular helps us with that double submit cookie pattern is that it has built-in support for it to send that CSRF token value in a API header, and that's what the backend could use for the verification. So if we take a look at the HTTP client XSR module, what we see is it provides an interceptor, which is the part that takes that cookie value and adds it onto the API headers. And you also have a way, when you incorporate this within your application, to configure the cookie name and the header name as well if you don't like the defaults. Now, if you are a fan of standalone, you don't want to use modules anymore, you can also use the provide HTTP client method. And this gives you XSR protection just out of the box. It has a double submit cookie pattern built in. You can also pass in a configuration method if you'd like to override the default values. Lastly, the bulk of the #1 OWASP vulnerability broken access control includes the accidental elevation of privilege. This is where somebody who doesn't have the access levels they should is able to view data that they shouldn't, or is able to perform actions that they shouldn't. Now, in this case, there's active work we need to do as developers to implement these access control checks. This isn't something Angular can provide for free because access control measures are so unique to each software system. However, Angular gives us the building blocks that we need to implement the access controls. And those building blocks include route guards, so you can protect certain routes based off of access control measures. You can also use structural directives, such as the ngIf or control flow, or you can even create your own custom directive if you have highly complex access control checks. And you can also use interceptors, such as adding the authorization header to outgoing calls or anything else that your software system might need. So as you can see, all these different ways Angular keeps us safe by using Angular's building blocks and built-in security checks and interpolation and property binding. We have security. And when we need to add access control measures, Angular gives us the way to do that as well. If you'd like to learn more about this, then you can check out my I have a 4-part series about web security, specifically with Angular. It's in that bit.ly link. You can also check out all of the code for this project. I have it on my GitHub. It's got all sorts of information about what we looked at today, examples, as well as it's a really good starting place for creating your own K-drama fan site if you'd like. My slides are available on my site, and if you have a Pluralsight membership, then you can also check out more about this on a Pluralsight course I wrote. Finally, feel free to reach out to me at Alisa Duncan if you have any questions about auth, about security, or if you want to talk about K-dramas, because I love talking about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alisa, for this great presentation. And I have to totally agree with you that even that most of that are not the security expert, we should try our best to make our apps as secure as possible, utilizing everything that our framework provides us with. And
yes.
Yeah, and before we jump directly to the Q&A session from the community, I would like to ask you one more question. Maybe it's not strongly related with your presentation, but might be also very interested for our community. So
Okay.
what is one of the most awaited feature from upcoming Angular 17 version?
Well, I don't know about everybody because there's just so much out there that's so exciting. But for me, I think I'm interested in hearing more about control flow and seeing how that works. It looks like it's really ergonomic and also highly performant. So I'm excited to see usage of that and also how it grows as we utilize it more and want to use it for even access control measures and things like that.
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting for me as well. So I will jump directly to the community questions. We have already the first one.
Okay.
So Domin asks, are there any third-party tools to validate if my website is safe?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the answer is yes. Thankfully, OWASP does have different projects out there that will do different sort of checks and like penetration testing and things like that. So I would recommend checking out OWASP's documentation and projects. They have not just tooling, but also even a testing guide to walk through as well.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Sonic Walk. There are too much lists to be memorized. Any tips that we can remember easier?
Too many lists. Okay, well, I think I want to refer back to OWASP again, because if you're going to look at one top 10 list, I actually may not even suggest the OWASP top 10. I might recommend another top 10 list they have, which is called, I think, the OWASP cheat sheet. It is exactly what developers need, written for developers on how to create secure applications. Now, some of the stuff in there is not Angular specific though, right? But those are the things that we should always keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. So if you guys have any additional questions, there is the time to ask. Let us wait maybe a while. Maybe some other question will pop up. Okay, then it seems, Lisa, that will be everything from our community. And
right.
for us, we have one. So
okay,
let me bring it on. Oh, I don't know how to properly spell your name, so I'm really sorry. And the question is there any advantage of using Signet double submit cookie versus the much easier custom request header approach?
I'm trying to understand this question. Are you talking about why? Well, I mean, I wonder if there's something different with the signed double submit cookie. The double submit cookie pattern does pass in the value of the CSRF token in a secondary source, which happens to be a custom header approach. So that's why I'm getting a little maybe confused by this question, but the recommendation is to use the there's two different sorts of patterns. The double submit cookie pattern is what we should be using for SPAs. The other one is for more traditional server-rendered applications. So I would recommend doing that. That's the one that is recommended by security experts. And anytime we try to roll our own way around security things because we're ease of use is when we can get into trouble, right? So I try to follow security best practices from security experts because I'm not one. And so I'd rather make sure that I'm following the recommendations from people who are doing this in the field.
Thank you. There is another question from Sonic Walk. Injection is not the same dependency injection, right?
Yes, that is correct. So in this case, injection is injection-related attacks. So this is where a attacker can submit values to you that contains bits of code, and if you are not properly handling those values properly, you can have problems, which is not the same as dependency injection within Angular. That is a programming pattern.
Okay, we have the additional comment from the Falgun. So I don't know whether it will bring you some context to your answer and whether it will somehow change it for you. But
I'm sorry, I don't know if I can answer this question because I mean,
yeah.
it is using a custom request header. So
Yeah.
I feel like we're talking about the same thing here.
Okay, so that seems like everything. It's been an absolute pleasure for having you as a speaker today. Your presentation was informative and inspiring. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And I hope to see you again in the future meetups and see you soon in Poland because we'll have occasion to see.
Yes, looking forward to meeting you next week.
Okay, so
right.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive right now into our second presentation. It's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Stefan Haas. He's an author of NG Journal, The Place Beyond Fundamentals, and also an NX champion. His contributions have been very valuable for the Angular community. Thank you, Stefan, for making time to be with us. We are eagerly looking forward to your talk on modular monoliths with NX.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, we also are very happy that you are with us. And also, before we delve into your presentation, I would like to ask you the quick question. Because you're an NX champion and you have done so much remarkable work in the Angular community, can you share a key insight or lessons you have learned during your journey with NX that you think our audience would find particularly interesting and valuable?
Sure. I mean, yeah. One particular lesson that I think is quite interesting is that although NX is really seen as and advertised even as this library for performance, and they advertise NX as of making it more fast to build stuff. It is also really it's also really helping to architect applications because of the module boundaries. And this is an aspect that many companies really forget, and they only tend to use NX for performance, although NX can help you a lot with the architecture as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. So without taking you more time, the stage is yours. I wish you good luck and see you at the Q&A session.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just dive into my talk about modular monoliths with NX. But first, just let me very quickly introduce you to myself. Hi, I'm Stefan. I'm mainly focusing on Angular and NX. Since this summer, I'm an NX champion. If you don't know what an NX champion is, this is basically a GDE program or an MVP program, but for NX. I'm also a freelancer and actually open to work right now. I'm also a trainer, a consultant, and a blogger. So if you enjoy Angular and NX, and especially enterprise topics, I would definitely advise you to check out my blog at angjournal.com, where you really find articles beyond the fundamentals. And for the motivation, Why should we even care about front-end architecture? Why should we strive for modular monoliths? And for this, let's have a look at this this right here. Right here, we can see just a traditional monolith. It's just this black box thing where things inside of it just evolve over time without a lot of structure. So over time, inside the components really start to intertwine with each other, and it just mutates over time to this big ball of mud, which you would call it in terms of domain-driven design. And the problem with this thing right here is that when you have such an intertwined system and you make a change in one part of the system, you cannot really predict how it affects the other parts of the systems, because they're really so intertwined with each other. And you really basically want to avoid that, because if you have something like this, in the end, you end up with a lot of bugs. So instead of going with such monolith without any rules, where everything can depend on everything, basically, we want to strive for a modular monolith. So still a monolith, not to be mistaken with micro frontends or microservices, but basically a monolith with the simplicity of a monolith, but with very clear boundaries and a very clear structure. Because now if we make a change, for example, in one of those tiny boxes, which is sort of a module or a subsystem in our monolith, we can be a lot more certain that this change only affects this very module and nothing else. Okay, for this, we have to dive into monorepositories. First, let's go one step back and let's look at this poly repo. Right here, we have an application. This application lives inside just one repository. And usually your applications depend on libraries. And where does this library live? Also in a repository. And this then is consumed via NPM. Basically, you would build the library, you would publish it to NPM, and consume it through some version number, which you would reference in an NPM registry and have the artifact in your node modules. Then you have another library also living in its own repository. And then you have another library, which is a transient dependency for your app, where your library A and your library B depends on. And maybe you already spotted the issue. Right here, we have a version conflict, because we're depending on library C 2 times, but with different versions, and they collide. So we have a version conflict right here, and something like this is really terrible in the real world. So we want to avoid that. An easy fix would be to go with a monorepo, because in a monorepo, you no longer have to distribute your libraries via NPM. You can just directly reference them, because all of your apps, all of your libraries are just living in one repository. All you have to do is basically just import something from your file structure, and you're good to go. So to sum it up, why should you use a monorepo? Well, as I said, you just have one version. So you have the single version policy, which means that, first of all, you don't need to care about semantic versioning at all anymore. You're no longer distributing anything to NPM. You no longer have to version anything. You're just using the things directly without anything else. You also have consistent third-party dependencies. This means that every library, every app inside your monorepository usually share the same package JSON, also meaning they share the same node modules. So all of your libraries, all of your apps depend on the same version of Angular. They use the same Angular version, they use the same RxJS version, they use the same NGRX. This is really powerful, because there you won't have any version mismatches. And you also on top get consistent tooling. Just think about Jest, ESLint, or Prettier. You have that for all of your projects out of the box. And consuming libraries is also, like I said, really a lot easier, because with a poly repo, you would have to go through these steps. So first, when you make a change inside your library that is meant to be consumed by your app, you have to increase the version number. Then you have to do an ng build. Then you have to do an npm publish. And then you have to go to the app, do an npm install of the latest version. And you might be unlucky. You find out, oh, there is a bug inside your new version. What do you have to do? Yeah, you have to go back to the library, do the fix, Then increase the version number again, do another build, do another publish, and install it again. So you get the gist. It's a bit tedious. You don't want to have to do this for all of your libraries, especially if you are working on an enterprise project where you have dozens of libraries. So instead, with a monorepo, you could just have something like this. All you have to do is to say, hey, import my something, could be function, could be a constant, could be anything from my library. And although this right here looks like you're depending on some third-party library because of the @ sign, this is not a third-party dependency. You're actually doing a TypeScript path mapping right here. This means this @ngjournal/lib is just a path mapping and is showing to an index.ts file inside your monorepo. So basically behind the scenes, that is just doing something like ../../lib something, and you just go through the file structure. And for me, this is obviously the winner, because you have to care a lot less about the automation workflow of consuming libraries. Okay, now that all this sounds so good, where's actually the catch? Why is not everybody already using monorepos? And the answer is monorepos usually tend to get really, really large, because in practice, I've seen monorepos usually with about 200 libraries usually, or even more. And this is a lot to deal with. So we need some professional tooling there. And usually the answer for this for me is NX. And first of all, let me say NX is a third-party tool. And this is something that is not so usually seen in the Angular ecosystem, because Angular is seen as this all batteries included framework that gives you everything you need out of the box. So why would you want another third-party tool, which is sort of not so natural to use in Angular? Because it's the de facto industry standard. And that's just my observation. But here's the reason why I think NX is still being used against the Angular CLI. So everything you're used to is really, really working just the same. So something like an ng generate component still works the same. An ng generate service still works the same. But you get a lot of tooling on top of that, which is really useful when you are working with monorepos. Some of those tools and features are caching. So NX makes it really a lot faster for you. You get interactive graphs, you get some generators for automating your code workflow. And this is all really nice and good. But now let's talk about the one killer feature for NX, which is going beyond just making things performant and manageable. Let's talk about modularization, because that is forgotten a lot, but it really enables a lot of architectural stuff that you can do with NX. And for this, let's have a look at a very traditional Angular architecture first. Usually this architecture can be found in books, in tutorials, or in beginner videos quite often. You start with an app component, and you would structure your application into features, usually into feature modules. And then these feature modules are usually lazy loaded, and all of those modules are usually depending on some shared module. This is basically what you see all over the place. And this thing is totally okay and works for most cases until it doesn't work anymore. Because over time, things just mutate, things just evolve, and you might end up with this intertwined system again, where one feature depends on another feature depends on another, and everything is just intertwined again. And then you're back at the story where you have a bug fix right here, and you make a tweak right there, and somewhere else in some very unpredictable other place in your system, something else breaks because everything is just so interconnected. So this is something that we want to avoid. We don't want to end with this. So instead, we're thinking about boundaries beforehand. We now really make very isolated systems, isolated modules. For example, we say that these three libraries on the top left are just in its own boundary, and the other libraries are in boundary B. And we then make the rule that boundary A is not allowed to depend on boundary B, vice versa. So you really have some isolation there. And then whenever I make a change in my boundary A, I can now really be certain that this change only has effects inside my boundary A. So my system at scale is more predictable, more maintainable, more extendable. Now that we've seen that this really looks nice on an abstract level, how can we actually achieve something like this in the code? And for this, we should have a look at the ESLint or CJSON file, because we can configure that through the linter. NX already provides us with a linting rule that can be really easily be extended, which is called the NX enforce module boundaries rule. Inside here, you will find the dependency constraints array, where you can just add these objects, where you say you have some source tag, and this tag comes from a project JSON file, which every library inside your monorepo has, and you can basically give each library an arbitrary amount of tags, which are really arbitrarily be chosen. And then you can say, hey, my boundary A is only allowed to depend on libraries with tags boundary A and shared. You can say the same for B. So B is allowed to depend on B and shared. Shared is only allowed to depend on shared. And what you end up with now is something like this. Inside your IDE, when you try to be really naughty and when you're inside your boundary A, inside this file called foo A, and you want to import the function foo B from your boundary B, you're basically being naughty. You're doing something that you are not allowed to do, and your IDE tells you this. So you get a linting error, and your IDE tells you, hey, a project tagged with boundary A can only depend on libs tagged with boundary A and shared. So you get immediate feedback from your IDE. And this is really a killer feature for me, because you can now enforce architectural rules and violate against that and really validate if your architecture is correct or not. So this is really nice on a technical level. But now you might start thinking and ask yourself, okay, this looks really cool, but how should I use these techniques, and how should I structure my application then? And for this, I usually tend to reference the enterprise monorepo pattern, which stems from the Enterprise Angular Monorepo Patterns book by NX, which featured a lot of patterns that can be used with monorepos. But this pattern right here is probably the most commonly and most popularly used pattern, which I would just call the enterprise monorepo pattern. For this, just have a look at this example. Let's imagine an insurance application, which we would not just develop like this in this monolithic fashion. We would start by slicing the application into tinier modules. So first of all, we do some vertical slicing. We slice our insurance portal into slices. So first slice would be, for example, a claim slice, where we organize all of our components and services which are related to the claim. And then we have a contract slice, maybe a complaint slice, a customer slice, and all of our applications have some shared slice. And usually we would call these slices domains. And to be honest, this is actually the hardest part in the real world on a project, to really identify those domains. And it's really easy for me to just put that on a slide. But in practice, it's really, really hard, because it's not so clear where to draw the boundaries and where to make a cut. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do I slice an app then? And where do I slice it? And for this, I would recommend you checking out domain-driven design, because that might give you some answers, or at least some indications to where to slice an application. Then, after we have our domains identified, we do even further slicing. So we make some horizontal slicing. We split our domain into layers. And we start with the uppermost layer, and we go downwards, where the upper layers are allowed to depend on the lower layers, whereas the lower layers are not allowed to depend on the upper layers. So let's start with the uppermost layer, which is called the feature layer. The feature layer now contains a lot of libraries which are only containing smart components. So components that are aware of the context that they are being used at, components that really model a certain use case. So these components are not meant to be reused at all. And as a rule of thumb, those components usually tend to inject stateful services. A layer below, you would find the UI layer. which contains libraries with DOM components. And DOM components, on the other hand, are now really not context aware. They're not modeling a specific use case, and they should be reused in multiple places. As a rule of thumb, a UI component or a DOM component is not allowed to inject stateful services, because then it would know too much about the context. And one layer below, we then find the data access layer, where we have data access libraries. And these libraries usually tend to include business logic, services, state management, and entities and model definitions. And now the lowest layer would be the utils layer, where we have util libraries with just some basic helper functions. Something like a date time transformation function, some string format functions, or some type utilities. And this is the classical enterprise monorepo pattern that you will find in most monorepositories as an architecture for our Angular applications. Now you might think, well, this all sounds really nice on paper and in theory, but in the real world, these modules are not really so isolated, and I somehow always have to share some dependencies. I somehow have to do some communication. And for this, we have to be smart. For example, here, if we have the contract domain and the claim domain, we should not just directly allow the claim domain to access everything inside our other domain. So something like this is forbidden. We don't allow a direct access, because then everything is allowed. We don't have any rules anymore. And instead, we can do something like this. We can use a shared kernel. So meaning we would extract the contract date picker that we saw, which was the shared component, inside our shared kernel. And now our domains, our contract domain and our claim domain, are allowed to depend on the contract date picker. This is a totally valid approach, but in practice, I would advise you not to overuse this. Because if you do this for all of your dependencies, your shared kernel is just growing and growing and growing larger over time, which makes it the central piece of your application, such that it's falling back into this monolithic design again. So instead, I would advise you to use something else called private API. So you would create a dedicated library just as a private API inside your domain, which really exposes just the bare minimum needed by the other consuming domain. So for the claim domain, I would create a claim API inside my contract domain, which exposes just the contract date picker. And now the contract domain might have 100 other components, but those are not accessible to the claim domain directly. They would have to be explicitly exported in the claim API. In practice, this looks like something like this. You would basically just have one barrel file inside your claim API. So the index.ts file, where you really have to be very explicit and say, I want to export this and this and that, and everything else is not exported and not accessible to our claim domain. And you would basically have one API for each consuming domain. So if you have a customer domain and customer wants something from contract, you also need a customer API. Good. And there's actually one more thing to all that, and that is that I usually use a slight variation to the enterprise monorepo pattern, because this pattern that I've shown you before with the layers of feature, UI, data access, and utils usually has a few problems. First problem would be that UI is allowed to inject services. Why is it allowed to inject services? Well, if we think back, the UI layer was one layer above data access. Data access containing all of the state management, meaning that UI is allowed to depend on data access, that UI components and DOM components could theoretically inject services, which would violate the smart versus DOM component principle. Another issue is that utils are not allowed to use models. Why is that so? Because utils is one layer below the data access. The data access is containing our model definitions. And sometimes we need to make type predicates to narrow down some types. And that is not possible because utils is not allowed to depend on data access, where our models are stored. And then you might ask yourself, well, where do I put the routes? And in order to address all of these problems, I made a slight variation to the enterprise monorepo pattern. So right here, we see the classic enterprise monorepo pattern, and I made exactly this variation, which I use a lot in practice. So what have I done? I have added a new layer above feature, which is my routes layer, which is just one library, which just basically makes it possible to compose multiple features on a page and just cares about the routing. And then the next thing is that models are now extracted from the data access library into its own layer, into the models layer. And now this solves two problems. First problem is that UI is now not anymore allowed to depend on data access. Why is that so? Because we're able to move the data access layer or the data access library one layer above into the same layer as the UI layer, such that UI is no longer allowed to depend on data access. And now models are down below, because UI had to depend on models. Now they don't have to depend on data access anymore. Now data access only contains logic, services, and state, which is not really important to UI. UI only needs models. And the other issue that it solved is is that models is one layer below utils, and now we can create type predicate functions in our utils libraries. So this architecture right here solved a lot of problems that I had with the classic enterprise monorepo pattern. Okay, this right here now was a lot of theory, and I would just say, in order to really get the gist of it, let's just dive right into a demonstration. So for this, I have prepared something. I have this insurance portal, which I usually use to showcase the enterprise monorepo pattern. Basically, like shown in the slides, I have a contracts domain, claims domain, complaints, customers, basically showing a list of things, and you can view some details. Here we link to a customer, for example, and we can even edit and create some of the entities. Okay, inside the code, this looks like this. I have this monorepo right here with an API that is actually a nest API. So you can even put some other stuff into an NX monorepo in Angular. And in the insurance portal app, that is my Angular app. And inside this libs folder, I have a folder for each domain. So for example, if we look at claim, I have the claim folder that is containing a lot of libraries now. A data access library, a feature library, not a feature library, not a feature library, my models library, my routes library, UI library, and utils library. And this is the structure for all of my domains. You can even visualize that through the project graph, which I've already started up. So this is the interactive graph that I was talking about before. So here you could see all of the dependencies live of your app. So for example, right here, you would also see that this dependency graph already looks quite similar to what I've shown you on the last slide. On top, we have the claim routes library inside our claim folder right here. Then we have a feature, another feature, another feature on this layer, the layer below data access, and now UI in the same layer, such that UI is no longer allowed to depend on data access. Layer below the utils, and the layer now below the models. And this basically for all of our libraries and domains. And with some special cases where we have some APIs, for example, because our claim domain needs to have something from the contract data access library. And instead of going directly to the contract data access library, we need to go through this entry point, through this private API, which just exposes the one thing needed in the contract data access library. And yeah, that's that with the plugin, with the NX graph. And I would just show you how I can even configure all of that. And that is basically all here in the ESLint.c.json file, where we have the NX enforce module boundaries rule, which is extended to have some dependency constraints. For example, here we have a type, we have a constraint for the routes. So we say libs marked with the tag type routes are only allowed to depend on other libraries marked with the tag type feature, data access, and utils. And we do this for all layers. So for an API, for feature, a UI, data access, utils, and models. And then we also have to do this for each of our vertical slices for our domains, where we say, for example, a domain shared is only allowed to depend on domain shared. For contract, we say it's only allowed to depend on contract, shared, and here the special libraries are API libraries, such that we depend on things from other libraries and domains. Okay, let's now try something naughty. Let's go into our claim domain, into a UI library where I have my claim form component.ts. And right here, I will do something which is not allowed. I will try to import some feature component. So my feature list, or I think it's called list component from claim feature list. And I get directly an error message and my IDE tells me, hey, this is not allowed. And I get instant feedback that I am currently trying to violate my architecture. And you know what is even better? I can even automate that. Because that's just a lint, I just have to do an NX lint. And that is basically linting my library. So right here, I have claim UI. The typo. I can lint for my claim UI. And I get an error right here in the console as well. That means that I can also put the NX lint into my CI/CD pipelines, where I can validate that as well, if my architecture is valid or not. So that's that. I hope you could get some insights to this right here, into the code, and see what this abstract and theoretical concept looks like in code. If you want to have another look on this, because I know this is a really a lot of stuff to just digest in such a short period of time, I would recommend you checking out this repository. This is a public repository on my GitHub. It's called ng Journal Insurance Portal, and you can find all the code in there. And if you liked this topic and this NX, and you want to learn more about NX and Angular and how you can leverage NX for your project, I am also doing a workshop for NX where you can learn even more about modularization, even more on NX caching in order to make your application fast, where you learn about distributed caching, incremental builds, custom remote caches. You will learn about NX plugins where you create your custom generators. You will see the NX dev kit. You will learn about templating, and you will see how you can create some CI/CD with NX. So if you're interested in an NX workshop, either remote or on-site in the EU, then check out ngjournal.com, where you can find this workshop. And with these words, thank you very much for listening to my talk. I hope you all could learn something today.
Thank you, Stefan. That was really the great presentation. And I have to say that the way you have explained how we should handle dependencies, lawyering, and so on was very easy to follow, which is not easy to do, because these concepts are pretty tough to learn at the very beginning, but listening to your presentation, it was easy to follow and understand all of these rules and how we should more or less set up our dependencies. So big congratulations because of that. And
Thank you very much.
I would like to ask you the question, because before we jump to the Q&A session, and it will be exactly the same question I asked Alisa. So what is your most awaited feature from upcoming Angular 17?
Well, I think the most obvious answer is the new control flow, because it's the biggest, most prominent change. But especially with regards to the new control flow, I think the most nice thing about it is the deferrable blocks. I'm really interested in working with that. So yeah, that's for me the most interesting thing about Angular 17.
Yeah, for me, honestly, same. So right now, let's jump to the Q&A session, because there is pretty a lot of questions. And the first one is from Muhtadi Bakali. Do you use any centralized tool to manage logs and errors on a monorepo app?
So I personally don't do that. Yeah, I mean, logs and errors, I'm not sure if you're asking about runtime errors. If you're asking about runtime errors in your app, I have used something like Sentry before to do so. But for the monorepo itself, I'm not using any tool to log errors, because I would just, when I have an error inside, for example, with the linting, I would have some pre-commit scripts, for example, or some CI/CD stuff to validate against violations of that. And I'm only checking in code that is working. So hope that can answer this question.
Okay. The next question is from Jay Calls. Which parts of the domain should be shared through an API? Utils, models, data access, UI components?
Usually you are allowed, or you should share just utils, models, data access, and UI, and should not share features. But I've run into some edge cases in the past where I had to also share some features. So I usually just allow everything to be shared through the APIs. I mean, the APIs itself are a hot topic, and you could even violate some of your layering with APIs if you're not careful with that, because you could say that you can access an API in utils, and you might expose some UI stuff inside your API. So then sort of through the API, you would be allowed that a util library could depend theoretically on a UI library. So I would really be careful about APIs, and I would try to just share the least amount possible, and usually just share the more dumb stuff and not so context-aware stuff. So yeah.
Okay. There is another question from Sonic Walk, whether there are some potential tools to prevent developers from passing observables from smart to dummy components.
I mean, I haven't used some of those, but I could definitely imagine that you could write an ESLint plugin that checks if there's an input of type observable that could check for that as well. So that would definitely be possible.
Okay. And the next question from Sonic Walk. What about best architectural practices for Signal?
Well, that's an open-ended question. I think signals don't really affect this architecture because this is a really big picture architecture where it's not really important if you use promises even, or observables or signals. So I would say signals don't really have an effect on this kind of architecture.
Okay, there is next question from Mothadi Bakali. Do you have some type of libraries to manage cross-cutting concerns?
Yeah, so these libraries would then be located in the shared kernel, basically like a shared module. For example, something like authentication would be managed inside your shared domain, and everything else can depend on shared then. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from Muhammad. Do you have recommended a certain book or an online course for being professional in Angular architecture and monorepos?
I mean, I don't really have a certain book or anything. For me, what helped me was really being active in the community, reading a lot of Twitter threads and a lot of blog posts. I think you can find a lot of blog posts talking about different kinds of architectures, maybe even some hexagonal or clean architectures. So definitely check out some advanced blogs and follow some of those Angular influencers, I would say, yeah.
Okay. Krzysztof asks, in a complex monorepo, how do you deal with different teams being ready at different time to adopt a new version of shared lib in the libs apps these teams own?
That is really the hardest part about monorepos, because in a polyrepo, you were able to make such a change to, say, your library and publish a new version of it, and nobody else was forced to really update your library. But now with a monorepo, if you make a change that affects everything else, you have to manage that somehow, that everyone else is doing that at the same time. And that is definitely something of a complex topic, definitely in organization. And you really have to be careful about that. And depending on the size of your application, sometimes it might be useful to put some of those changes or refactorings into NX generators, which are basically just a schematic for executing all of your changes and pushing that into the master, such that you can work on that over a longer period of time. And then executing all of those generators at a time when you're ready with that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Jakub. How do you share library of a basic controls with other separate projects?
So for this, I would also use the shared kernel again. So in the shared domain or in the shared kernel, you would just create a UI library. So a UI layer where you have a library called UI, where you have your controls, and every other domain is basically allowed to depend on that, because we specified in our ESLint JSON that our libraries or our other domains are allowed to depend on the tag shared, such that everything is shared can be used in other domains.
Okay, and I will choose the last question. And if you can, after all, Stefan, jump maybe to the chat and try to answer the other question, because there is so much of them. So Jakub asks, Kuba Natonek asks, should we split every or most of them components into separate libraries, or it's overkill? Example, shared UI components.
That's a really interesting question. I personally actually made a project a while ago where I basically put every file into one library. So single file libraries. The benefit you have is that you can make very fine-grained architecture rules, and even for the performance, you can really cache a lot of the stuff then. But to be honest, code should live where it's being used at, and I would try to find some sweet spot. And I have a rule of thumb to just have five files at most per library.
Okay, so thank you, Stefan. As we wrap up your presentation, we want to extend our heartfelt thanks. Your insights have left a lasting impression. We look forward for the possibility for having you as a speaker again in the future, and have a nice evening.
Thanks, it was a pleasure for me.
Okay, so for our final presentation today, we have something truly special in the store. Marko Stanimirovic will be shedding light on demystifying advanced TypeScript concepts behind NGRX API. Marko is not only a core member of NGRX and Analog.js teams, but also a distinguished Google developer expert in Angular. He is also an instrumental organizer on the Angular Belgrade group. And here is an exciting update, because Marko is gearing up for Angular Day in Belgrade on November 4th, an event you wouldn't want to miss. Thank you, Marko, for being a part of our event.
Hey, Mateus. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, hi. So, Marko, before we dive into your presentation, I would like to touch upon your role as an organizer of Angular Belgrade Group. And could you share with us a bit about your preparation for Angular Day in Belgrade on November 4th? What can attendees look forward to, and how has the planning been going?
Yeah, so there will be a lot of interesting talks and topics to cover. We will talk about signals, about NGRX, about how signals and NGRX can work together. There will be also talk about NGRX Signal Store, the upcoming library from the NGRX group. Besides that, there will be talk about Analog.js, more specifically about file-based routing. Mateus, by the way, will also give a talk about server-side rendering and a few more interesting topics. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. To be honest, we were not aware of all the things that needs to be done when we started planning this event, because it was different from events that we organized so far. This will be a full-day event, and it was challenging but fortunately we finished everything on time. Everything is ready, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next week and Angular Belgrade Day.
Yeah, honestly, me too, and can't wait to meet you in person. So without taking more time, the stage is yours, and I wish you good luck and see you at the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. So yeah, okay, it's going to share right now. Today I'm going to talk about advanced TypeScript. We'll learn more about generics, about conditional and recursive types, about function overloading, and more. And we will try to learn all these concepts by re-implementing some popular NGRX APIs. And the first API that we'll try to re-implement is create feature. I created this feature. It's almost about 2 years ago, something like that. And it's primarily used to reduce the repetitive code that we had in our selectors file. So let me quickly show you what this function does if you're not familiar with that. So we can create a custom NGRX feature. Let's call it users feature, for example. So I'll create a constant users feature, and then I'll call it create feature function and import it from the NGRX store package. This function accepts a config object with two required properties. The first property is a feature name. So we can say, for example, name, this feature is users. And the second is feature reducer. So if I pass the reducer here, we can directly call create reducer. And for example, pass here and say that we want to have selected user, which is type of, let's say it's initially null, and it can be string or null as a type. Besides that, I also want to specify that we have, for example, list of users. So we can say it's an empty and it's type of strings. We can define a type but for user, but it's not really important in this example. So when we pass the feature name, we pass the feature reducer. As a result, we will get the object that contains the following things. So if we try to use auto-completion, you can see that users feature will contain the reducer and it will contain the feature name that we passed as an input argument. But create feature will also generate selectors for us. It will generate the feature selector. So with name select user state, as you can see here. So this object will contain a feature selector and selector for each feature state property. In this case, we have selected user and list of users as feature state properties. So it will generate select users and select selected user. And everything is strongly typed, of course. If we, let me say, const result is equal. So here you can see that type of select user selector is memory selector. This is the type of record string and is the type of the global state. And as a result, you can see that we have string or null, which is exactly what we specified here. Okay, let's now try to re-implement this function. And we will not focus on the implementation, but only on types. So I will create a new function and I will call it my create feature. I will use declare because, as I said, we'll just focus on type. Declare function my create feature. And as we saw here, this function accepts a config object with two required properties. The first property is name, which is type of string. And the second property should be reducer. We will start by passing only the initial state to simplify this function initially, and then we will back to reducer. So I will say initial state, and let's put any in the beginning like this. And as a result, I will return an empty object for now. Let's now try to call this function. So if I say const, or we can replace it directly here, my create feature, and instead of reducer, I will add state here, initial state, which is this. So If we inspect the type, you can see that it's an empty object. If we inspect the input argument, you see that the name is type of string, initial state is type of any. In order to be able to define the strongly typed keys, so to define keys for selectors and string literals, we need to use generics here. We need to infer the name as a string literal, not as a string. And the same is for initial state. We need to infer the exact type that is passed here. So to do that, I will use generics here, and we can say that we'll have two generics. First is name, that extends string, and the second one will be state. So then we can say that name is type of name generic and initial state is type of state generic. If we check how it looks right now, you can see that our input argument is now correctly, type of our input argument is correctly inferred. The type of name is users, so it's not a string, but it's a string literal users. That's exactly what we need in order to be able to define select users state property. And also for the initial state, you can see that it's correctly inferred. So now it's time to try to find a way how we can define a result. And as we saw, users feature should return a feature selector and selector for each feature state property. Let's first try to define feature selector. So here we can, in order to get this name string literal, we can do something like this: key in name. And then as a result, I want to say that this is type of memoized selector that has object as a global state type, and as a result, it has state. In other words, it has a feature state as a result. Now, if we try to type users feature.users, you can see the name is users, so it correctly inferred. It took this string literal name here and returned it as a type. And we can see that now we have type of this is memoized selector that has our state as a result. But we don't want our feature selector to have name users. We want to have select prefix and state suffix, right? And to do that, we need to change our type definition here. So here we can say something like this. We can say as, and then define a type for this property as a template literal. So I want to say select as a prefix, then I can add key here. So this is a type, this is our name. And after that, I want to add a state suffix. If we now inspect the users feature, you can see that we have select users state here. The last step that we want to do is to capitalize this property name. So we can do that here. We can say capitalize key like this. Yeah, capitalize keys. By the way, this is built-in TypeScript type. We don't need to define this by ourselves. So as we have, I don't know, omit, exclude, pick, and all other utilities that TypeScript provides, it also provides this capitalize utility type that works with string literals. So now if we type dot, you can see that now we have select user state name, which is strongly typed. And this is exactly what we want to achieve. The next step is to define the type for selector for each feature state property. And here we can add intersection. And as a part of this second object, we can define selector for each feature state property. So what we can do, we can say key in key of state. We want to walk through each key from this state object, right? And then as a result, I want to return memoized selector that contains object, that has object as a global state type and state of key as a result. The last step here is to add select prefix and to capitalize the key, so we can do similar In a similar way here, we can say as select capitalize key. And now you will see the compilation error here, because potentially key can be string or number or symbol. But capitalize expects a string, so we need to cast this, and we can say and string like this. Let's now see what we got here. So if I say users feature dot, you can see that we now have three selectors. We have select selected user and select users, which are selected for feature state properties, and we also have select user state, which is a feature selector. So that's actually how types. This is a simplified version of how create feature types work. The last step was to replace this initial state with reducer. So what we can do, instead of passing initial state, we can say reducer, and here use action. I think it's called action reducer type. And now instead of initial state, we can say reducer and use create reducer function that returns action reducer. But we are not interested in reducer, exact type of reducer. We are interested only in state in order to make selectors for feature state properties, so we can directly use state generic here. Okay, this was the first function that I wanted to show you. The next was create effect. And some time ago we introduced, I'm not sure if you are aware, but we introduced a new way of defining effects. We call them functional effects because now we don't need to create classes in order to define NGRX effects. But there was one problem when we were considering to introduce this feature. The problem was that if we want to keep a way of creating effects by using create effect function, we cannot use the existing signature and don't have breaking changes actually. So the trick was to introduce additional config object as a part of the create effect function input argument that will make this differentiation. So we will be able to differentiate functional effects from normal or let's say class-based effects. So let me show you. If we say constant my effect equal to create effect, and create effect accepts effect factory as an input argument. So here as a result we need to return observable that returns an action. I will define some dummy action. So I'd say const a equal to create action a like this, and then we can return off a here as a result. Yeah, we need to execute this because this is the action creator, not the action. So here, if we inspect the type of my create effect, you can see that type is observable, and it contains this typed action A, and also there is an intersection with create effect metadata because create effect will add some additional properties to our observable. So on the other hand, this is for class-based effects, but for functional effects, they are defined by using functional true flag. And let's now inspect the type of this effect. As you can see, the type now changed. The type is functional effect. So now, instead of returning an observable, the create effect function will return the effect factory itself with applied effect metadata. We needed this behavior because when we define functional effects, we didn't want to execute this callback immediately. Instead, it needs to be executed when effects are registered. So that's the reason why we need to return effect factory instead of effect factory result or observable. So to achieve this behavior, as you can see, based on this flag, if I say functional false here, now we will again have observable as a return type, not the function anymore. To achieve this behavior, we need to use function overloading. And I will first show you how function overloading works on a simple example. So let's try to define add function. Add function that has two signatures. One signature some can accept numbers and another signature accepts strings. So to have everything strongly typed, we need to define two signatures for the add function. First one will be with element, which is type of number, let's say element 1, and element 2, which is also type of number, and the result will be number. And the second signature will be with strings, like this. So now if I say const result is equal to add 1 and 2, the type of result will be number, as you can see, because it will point to the first signature of add function. But if I call it with 2 strings, then the result will be string. It will now point to the second signature. And this is exactly what we want to achieve with create effect function. When functional true is passed here, we want to return the effect factory itself with applied metadata. And when functional is set to false, or if we exclude our config object, we want to return the observable, the effect factory result. Let's now try to create my create effect function. So I will declare a new function. I'll call it my create effect. And this function accepts effect factory as an input argument, right? And the type of this effect factory is a function that should return observable. And this observable should be an action like this. Yeah, I want to import action from the NGRX store, and the result will be observable of action and create effect metadata, but we can leave it like this for now to simplify it. So now if I replace this create effect with my create effect, let's see. Yeah, the type you can see now will be observable of action. If I want to have strongly typed my create effect function, in other words, if I want to return the exact action type that is passed here as a result, I need to introduce generic. So we can say a extends action like this, and then we can pass a here and here. So now the type of my effect, as you can see, will be observable typed action a instead of just action. And the second part is to implement another signature that doesn't return observable, but returns the effect factory itself. But this, we need to point to this second signature only when functional true config is passed as a second input argument of my create function. So I will copy this. And as a second signature, I want to have different set of arguments, of input arguments. I want to say config here, and I want to have functional true, like this. So now, also, instead of returning observable A, I want to return effect factory itself. So now what we will do, we will define the generic for effect factory. We'll say effect factory that needs to extend a function that returns observable action, like this. So now we can here say this is type of effect factory. And as a result, I want to return effect factory. For the first signature, I also want to point to the first signature when functional is false or when config object is not passed. So to achieve this behavior, we can say for the first signature that it has config as an optional input argument, and if it's passed, functional needs to be false, like this. So now if we check here, you can see that we still point to the first signature. If I pass functional false here, we will get the same result. But if I change functional true, we will now point, you also can see that my ID is able to recognize that. We will now point to the second signature that returns the effect factory itself. So this is how functional overloading works. And the last example that I want to show you, probably the most interesting one, is how we created how we made create action group function. Maybe you heard about it. So we use create action group to define a group of actions, a group of action creators actually with the same source. We can say users API actions equal to create action group. Create action group accepts a config object with two required properties. The first is source, and source in this case will be users API, and the second one will be a dictionary of events. First event will be, for example, user created success. This will be the event name, and this action should be dispatched, for example, from user API effects when user is successfully created. And here is a value I want to define what is the payload of user created success action. And for that, we can use props function from the NGRX store package and pass here as an input generic argument. We can pass what's the type of payload for user created success action. So we can say, for example, user, which is type of string, like this. And I also want to define a second action. It will be user created failure. And it will have error message, that is type of string. Now let's inspect the result of users API of create action group function. So we will check what user API actions object now contains. So if we say users API actions dot, you can see that we now have users created failure and user created success action creators. For user created success action, we need, everything is of course strongly typed, we need to pass the user, which is type of string. If we inspect the type here, you can see that result is a typed action, and you can see another very interesting thing here. The create action group will automatically create the type for our action, but by applying source event pattern. So instead of the square brackets, it will take source string literal and put it there, and after that, it will also take the event string literal event name and put it as a event name for our action. So let's now try to create this function. Actually, I will say declare function my create action group like this. My create action group will accept config object, config with two properties. The first property will be source, and we need to define two generics here. The first generic will be source that extends string, and the second one will be a dictionary of events. So I can say events extends record. We can say that it extends record string any, because anything can be defined as a type for our payload. And now the type of source will be source, the type of events will be events. If we say this, and let's return something here, if I replace create action group with my create action group, let's now check. Yeah, we can see that our input arguments are correctly inferred. And that's the first very important step. Now we need to define the return type, the result. So as I told you, we need to return for each defined event here. We need to define the type for action creator that should be generated by the my create action group function. So what we need to do, we need to walk through the keys of events first to define this name for each action creator. We can say key in key of events. Let's first do this. And then as a result, we want to define an action creator that will have a payload, which is type of event, events of key, like this. And as a result, it needs to return action that contains type property plus the type of payload. So we can say it should return an object that contains type, and for type we want to apply source event pattern. So here I can say the type of this type property should be source, like this, and then here we will have our key. And again, the type of key can be potentially, even if we define string here, it can be number or symbol, so we need to cast it and say add string here. So this is the first step, and the second step is to add payload type itself. So we can use intersection and say and events of key. Let's format this. And if we try to replace my create action group, I also want to create my props custom function. This will be a very simple function. Declare function props. It will accept the generic and return a generic, that generic as a result, like this. I will define it, my props, like this. So we can use my create action group, and now here say my props and my props. Okay, let's now inspect the result. So now users API actions, if I said dot, you can see that it now contains these two events that we defined here, but the names of properties are equal to event names. And this is not what we want. What we want to caramelize this title case event name. So we want to remove these spaces and we want to uncapitalize the first letter. Let's now see how we can achieve that. So this needs to be done here. And first I will create a helper type and I will call it join. Join should remove all the spaces from the event name. So I will define a type, I will name it join, and join accepts a string as an input argument. So what I want to do here, I first want to check if my string contains space. We can do that in the following way. So we can say string extends, and now I'm asking for a special format here. Infer first, so, and here we can say infer rest. So I want to check if my string extends a string that has a space. And by using this infer keyword, I can get the type of the first, so of the part of this string before the space, and with infer rest, I want to take the type of this string after the space. So if this is true, I want to call join again. So I will recursively call the join type. And instead of passing this string, I want to pass the string without this space. So what we can do here, we can pass something like this. We can say first rest. But as you can see here, there is no space anymore. And if my str doesn't contain any string, any space, then I want to return str itself. Now let's try to use it here. So we can say as join key, right? And cast it to string like this. Let's now inspect the users API actions object. So if I say users API actions dot, you can see that we now have user created failure and user created success action creators. But the last thing that I want to do is to uncapitalize the first letter. So we can use another utility that TypeScript provides. It's called uncapitalize, and the result of join we can pass as an input generic argument to the uncapitalized type. And that's it. It should work right now. So if I say user created success, you can see that type of this is a function that has a payload, which is user string. This is exactly what we defined here. And as a result, we return payload plus we are returning object that contains type property. And you can see that type is properly defined, so it applies. We are applying source event pattern. We are taking the source string literal, users API, and then we are adding the event name user created success. So now to make this work, we need to pass the user string. And that's it. That's everything what I wanted to show you for today. Thank you very much for attention. And if you have any question, feel free to leave it on chat.
Thank you, Marco, for this great talk. It was really impressive to watch how easily you have almost re-implemented the typing behind the NGRX API. And of course, right now we will jump to the Q&A session. But before that, I would like to ask you, what is your most awaited feature of upcoming Angular 17 version?
For me, it's a new application builder that provides server-side rendering, static side generation out of the box.
Okay.
And also hydration improvements. But yeah, control flow is also very interesting, and especially new defer macro. So we will be able to apply lazy loading at a very granular level in a declarative manner, which is great.
Yeah, and there is also one extra thing that they are hiding behind us. So we will see what they have prepared for us. Okay, so jumping directly to the questions, there is first question from Ayman Adventures. Do you think that signals can be replacement for NGRX?
No, I don't think, because signals and NGRX can work very well together. NGRX is also, if we talk about NGRX store, in fact, it's also architectural pattern. It's not only the, I don't know, a replacement for something that Angular doesn't have. So currently, all NGRX packages that we have for state management, NGRX store and NGRX component store, two most popular ones, they have integration with Signal. So instead of store.select, you can now use store.select Signal, and instead of observable, you will get Signal as a result.
Okay.
That's about current existing packages, and we are also currently working on a new package. It's called NGRX Signal Store, and it will provide first-class support for Signal. So it's built with Signals. It has RxJS as an optional dependency. And at Angular Belgrade Day, I will give the first talk on Signal Store. If you're interested to hear more about it, you can also register to the NG Rome conference in December. I will give the same talk there as well. And I think that NG Rome has, so for online attendees, it will be free. So you can register and watch my talk there.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Jakub. What determines your choice of overloads over conditional types?
That's a really good question, because initial version of Create Effect had a lot of conditional typing. I think it can be the situation with types can be much simplified with overloads, and that's actually what I try to do with Create Effect function. Instead of using overloads, we could use conditional types for Create Effect. We could have single signature and say, okay, if config is type of functional true, then return effect factory, else return the effect factory result. But I think the situation is much simpler with overloads. So I prefer using overloads when possible.
Okay. There we have a question from Sonic Walk. If I understand, key and string is kind of casting.
Yes, exactly. Because when we are walking through the type, which is an object or record, each key can potentially not be just only a string, but it can be also a number or symbol. So all the TypeScript utilities that work with strings, with string literals, they expect string literal as an input argument. So yeah, you are right. We need to apply some kind of casting.
Okay, and there is probably last question from Jakub. In NGRX lib, do you use Prettify? You use many never.
Actually, I don't understand the question, but if you are asking, do we use Prettify as a library for formatting the code? Yeah, we're using it.
Okay, and that was probably the last question. So, Marco, you has been highlight of our meetup, and your expertise of demystifying the TypeScript concepts behind NGRX API was truly exceptional. And we hope to welcome you back as a speaker in the future, and see you soon in Belgrade.
Thank you. Looking forward to meet you in person. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so we are about to finish, but as I have promised, we have to say who has won our contest, which we have been running on our social medias. And that person is Szymon Świątek. So Szymon, if you are there with us, please reach out to us at our social media and capture your award. I also would like to remind you about our surveys, so please fill it up. It's very helpful. You can suggest also topics and speakers. You're able to find it right now at the chat, but also at the end of our meetup, it will be visible and accessible for you using QR code, which we will display. Thank you for joining us today. Remember to subscribe to our social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and meetup.com. So you wouldn't miss interesting Angular content and next meetup. Thank you. Have a nice day and evening for someone. So goodbye.